Placed in newsrooms and working with each other on a variety of digital projects, and their main goal was to innovate, to try new things for that newsroom, and put their creativity to the test to kind of prove what we have been researching over the past couple years. So I'm really excited to announce Angela, Gabby, Leanna, and Maggie, who will be sharing more about how they identified, researched, produced, and tracked the performance of a bunch of underreported stories during their fellowship. So I'll hand it over to you guys. Thank you so much.
So I'm Vivian. I'm a Northeastern student researcher, and that's Emily, who's also a Northeastern student researcher. And we formed under the Reinventing Local TV News Project the Underreported Story Generation team. So basically what we did as a team was we worked with the fellows in collaboration to pitch and produce underreported stories across all the markets. So what that kind of looked like was the students would meet and we went over all of the topics that we identified as underreported, and then we brainstormed pitches for each market. So that kind of looked like doing some preliminary research, identifying potential sources and doing a little bit of outreach. And then once there was a solid foundation for those stories, we kind of handed everything off to them, and then they executed all of those stories. So now we're going to tell you about kind of why we decided to invest our time and resources into identifying underreported stories. The first reason was that it allowed us to identify gaps in local news coverage. So we were able to find the topics that were receiving large amounts of coverage in newsrooms. So that was things like violent crime, politics, and entertainment. And then on the other hand, we found things that were receiving very little, if any, coverage. That was things like housing issues and environmental issues. And in examining, I guess, the comparison between what was being covered and what wasn't, we were able to kind of gauge which stories we need to be telling in order to give audiences a better understanding of the things that are going on around them. And that kind of leads into our my second point, which is that identifying underreported stories allowed us to alert and inform audiences of the issues that may be directly impacting them that they don't have enough information about or are just unaware of to begin with. And that deepens their understanding of their community, which is, of course, really important. And the coverage of underreported stories encourages policy change. Many of our underreported stories were centered public policy, and then that, of course, allows audiences the opportunity to learn and create change themselves. So we believe it's really important to be prioritizing underreported stories because it's essential in creating connection between community members and the broader systems and policies and places around them that they're experiencing and interacting with on a day-to-day basis. But with that being said, we're not here to discourage coverage of things that are really popular to see in news, like violent crime or entertainment, because those are also necessary components of painting a holistic image of a community. But our research does show that there's a lot of value in producing underreported stories, and we're going to kind of show you the data to tell you why that is. So Emily can talk about how we identified the underreported categories.
So we started off with this why, sort of this reason, and we also started off with some existing data and obviously like a lot of questions. We set out to analyze performance metrics from the fellows and find out if there was something in particular that we should be directing them to produce. So last summer, the data team continued a process of data collection that had started in summer 2023. We used an automatic data scraper that essentially collected like a number of different data points from like the link of an article, the person who wrote it, the date it was published, the time, the title, obviously, and sometimes the text and tags, and essentially that just popped it into a spreadsheet. We picked up from there and began using that data scraper again once a week, ultimately collecting over 6,000 articles, which we then converted to a sample size of about 530. In addition, we began collecting social media data, which is something that had not been done before in the year prior, and that's for both YouTube and Instagram. And we collected data like title, caption, date, views, and also links and comments if comments were available in those videos. Over the course of 10 weeks, we had over 1,500 data points, which is pretty wild. We also tried different methods of collecting the same data after 4 weeks to see if we could find any trends on virality, which revealed a lot about engagement traction on different platforms, from YouTube to YouTube Shorts to Instagram. For each article, we used another code to classify it, essentially categorizing it. into a category, which we determined through a set list with project leaders. And these topics were obviously checked with human verification. And through that, we were able to visualize these findings as seen in the graph, on the next slide, which sort of combines all three markets. But we found that overall, politics, entertainment, and violent crime were the most reported, as Vivian said. And from there, we were able to make determinations about what we call underreported stories. These do differ by market. So, for example, Chicago had a lot of entertainment, politics, and violent crime, whereas for Boston, there was a lot of stories about transportation. So we found these common reported topics across three markets, which we assume to be true for other markets as well. And Vivian said that, just because, these topics receive a lot of coverage doesn't mean we should stop giving them that coverage, but it does mean that we should be thinking about those topics that aren't receiving as much coverage, and dedicate some resources to those as well. So our research sort of makes the case for why we should be investing in underreported topics, and we're going to show you why. So once we collected this data, we handed it off to the fellows, and we're going to start with Angela and show what we did with it.
Yeah, so I guess when we talk about Chicago, I think my situation was a little interesting, a little bit, every fellow's experience was a little bit different. So in terms of Chicago, obviously the students weren't based in Chicago. Some of them had never even been to the city. So I think there was definitely this trying to be careful about parachute reporting, especially with locals here, there's a lot of other sensitive topics and you really want to understand the city itself. It's a really big city with a lot of different neighborhoods, and Lakeview isn't the same as South Side Hyde Park, and so kind of being careful about that. I think it really helps to, partner together, and I think also having my news director in that conversation, because we both live there, definitely helped. So the initial pitch for the story that I ended up producing, it initially came about as gentrification, these areas of Chicago that were being gentrified, but which I guess in the news it might not have been spoken as much about maybe, but if you're in Chicago, it's very well known. You talk to a local, they know about it. You talk to someone who's been raised and grown up in Chicago, they're probably more informed than you actually think. And so we kind of tried to pivot away from a common topic that was already pretty well reported within the city by local outlets like Block Club Chicago or some other local media outlets. So we were was reworking that story. I talked a lot with Nika, my news director, and there were definitely some time constraints within that. So kind of thinking about what were some of the constraints and what did we, but still wanting to report on an area that might have been underreported. So this was during the time when there was a migrant influx in Chicago, and it honestly was quite heavily reported on, buses of migrants coming into the city, migrant violence, but there was one aspect where we were oh, well, we're only talking about them within this major city of Chicago, but Illinois is massive and they're being sent everywhere. So we started pivoting towards that direction. What do the suburbs look like? Do they have the same opinion as the people living in the cities? So that's kind of where we initially started pivoting towards. And then as having more conversation with my news director, one thing we both noticed is why aren't we hearing from the migrants themselves? There are hundreds and thousands of these migrants coming into the city, but why haven't we even heard their voice? You hear snippets on news broadcasts, right? But we don't really hear what is going on in your day. You came to the city, you don't really speak English. What's happening? I think we'll go to the next slide. Yeah, so here's some examples of some of the headlines that you could see that ABC7 Chicago had already posted in regarding to the migrant crisis in the city. And in general, it's kind of talking about the migrant shelters. It's very much an eagle eye view onto what's happening in Chicago. But I think being in my position in a fellowship and kind of being a one-woman band, I definitely had the privilege to just go in and talk to them. So how that process really worked was I connected with a reporter already in the newsroom reporting on the migrant crisis, and she had given me some sources that I could reach out to. And some of those sources was like nonprofits or people who are running these shelters, or there was also a Catholic community that was, and this was honestly kind of lucky on my end, where when I contacted this source about, basically they were a Catholic church who was opening up this new volunteer event that was going to be happening twice a week for migrants to go to like pick up clothing items, to get food, to like kind of talk to like legal experts. And so ironically, right when I contacted them, that they had opened a new event, and they're like, do you have time to come this week? And I was like, oh, absolutely. And during this time, I was also kind of on a time crunch because we wanted to get these underreported stories within a certain amount of time. Yeah, so I ended up going to this volunteer event. But when I went initially, I did not bring a camera or a microphone. I kind of just went just to see what it was like, and kind of just to like get to know what it was like. And I know that can like, that's not necessarily a privilege in like a breaking news situation, or sometimes when you're on a really heavy time crunch. But I think when there is time, just having that time to get connected is incredibly important, because these are people who might not necessarily be willing to be on camera. And also, so how the process worked was that I had really talked to the people who were leading the organization. They also, like, there were some steps involved there because it's like kind of like the Catholic Church, so they're like also sensitive too. And then they also pointed out like individuals that that they had talked with were really active in volunteering in the community and giving back to the other migrants, as well as just for me to like see what it was like. Like, you can see these migrants picking up their clothes, volunteering, like communicating with others. So yeah, and that's kind of how I found Calvin. So if we go to the next slide. Yeah, so that was the video. I don't know if we're gonna play it, but so Calvin is I think he's like an early 20-year-old Venezuelan migrant. He has 2 parents and a younger sister, and his family had immigrated from Venezuela, I think, a couple of months before him volunteering here. And so what was interesting about Calvin to me was that he spends a majority of his week just at these volunteer events, where he distributes clothes, he organizes it, but like he also has like very broken English. So part of his time is also just spent learning English one-on-one with some of the other volunteers. And I think you don't really necessarily see in news like a young individual migrant who is trying to give back to his community and really trying to make something work. And so I felt like this was a really personal story. So I guess we can play a little bit. Yeah.
Mi nombre es Kelvin García. Llegué aquí aproximadamente en agosto. Primero, yo era como todos aquí, yo iba a desayunar, a bañarme a la iglesia de San Edmund. Ya cuando ya teníamos un tiempo, don Mateo, doña Celín empezaron a decirme que si podía ayudar en la iglesia y todas esas cuestiones, y ahí empecé a ayudar en la iglesia, a repartir ropa, cualquier cosa. La primera persona que me dijo para ayudar aquí fue don Mateo. Él fue el que me dijo que si podía ayudar, ya que no había muchos voluntarios. Entonces de ahí adelante empecé a ayudar y a venir seguido. Ah, ok. Me hace que les enseñamos. Llego aquí a las 7 de la mañana, ayudo a organizar lo que falta organizar. Después Ya cuando empiezan a llegar las personas, ayuda a recibir, hay veces que ayuda a entregar ropa o en cualquier otra área hasta después que ya se termina todo. O sea, me gusta que mantengo movimiento, ayudando a las personas. Yo llegué solo, ya mi familia estaba aquí en Chicago, estábamos en una estación de policía en donde duramos aproximadamente 2 meses hasta que nos sacaron y ahorita estamos en el Hotel Carlton. Mi mamá no quería que yo estuviera solo en otra parte y entonces nunca nos fuimos a un refugio porque no nos aceptaban a todos, sino me querían llevar a otro lugar a mí, ellos a otro lugar. Hasta que las personas de Opal nos trajeron al Hotel Carlton.
Mexico. Yeah. The Spanish way is Mexico, but we say Mexico.
La verdad todavía no sabemos qué vamos a hacer, ya que ni mi papá ni yo hemos conseguido un trabajo estable. Cualquier trabajo sería bueno para mí en este momento, ya que planeo trabajar y si se me hace posible seguir en las noches estudiando. Las personas son muy amables con nosotros, nos tratan muy bien y la verdad no me arrepiento de nada de haber venido. La verdad que, o sea, hemos tenido literalmente lo que se podría decir, una comodidad. Por lo menos tenemos comida, comemos las tres veces al día, cosa que en Venezuela es difícil. Por lo menos ayudamos a mi hermano que está en Venezuela, ya que está pasando por momentos difíciles, pues está solo. Entonces, con lo poco que trabajamos, lo podemos ayudar allá. Agradecido con el país.
Yeah. So I think one thing that's important to note is not necessarily like the topic itself isn't underreported, but maybe the angle itself isn't as commonly heard. And I think like one theme for at least Calvin that I really liked is that he's incredibly grateful. And I don't think you necessarily see that gratitude coming from migrants that you hear on the news necessarily. I think you hear a lot of I think there's a little bit of fear pandering or you hear about the situation, but you don't hear about how the individual is feeling. And I thought Calvin's also an incredible inspiration for as someone who is incredibly active in his community. And I think it was also a personal story that I think other people who come from immigrant families could also resonate with, that aspect of being really hardworking and trying to contribute back and really trying to be involved. So yeah, that was a story I did. Yeah.
Hi guys, I'm Maggie. I'm a stander, so I will be standing for this one. I got to spend the last year at CBS New York, which was fabulous, and work with some really amazing people. But my favorite part about it was that I got to really incorporate myself and bring my own narrative to the story, which is what I think makes my story, this one specifically, as well as many of my others, so different from other pieces that come out of CBS and other local newsrooms. So the Northeastern students came to me with a very simple question. How did New Yorkers eat? What do they eat? How do they access food? I currently live in Bed-Stuy, New York, and I love it more than anything. I live next to Do the Right Thing Way that Spike Lee's movie was based on. It is an amazing place. And they wanted to know what the cost of convenience is. How much does it cost to be able to get to Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, Amazon Fresh Markets, versus being able to go to your corner store bodega? And what's the difference in the quality of food, the price of food, and how long and how much it takes you to get to those places? So we took a deeper look at bodegas, and they're one of the most beloved establishments in New York, but bodegas aren't really reported on. There aren't really anything to talk about bodegas other than a crime was reported here or this or that happened, but not about the living, breathing soul that is a bodega. And to me, the main character of this story was Good Times in Bed-Stuy, which is my bodega. And if anyone who's been here knows exactly what I'm talking about. And it's a completely different place. So that was our initial pitch. So the process of this was very different from other videos that I've done. What I started with was knowing where I lived and then being able to map out the distance between the different supermarkets or what is considered high quality food stores, though I do consider bodega food incredibly high quality. So I worked really closely with Gabby, our animator, who helped me show the data visualization where you could see my block compared to how long it would take me on the subway versus how long it would take me on a ride share, the cost, the time. It's a big difference. And we found that the average time for a Bed-Stuy resident to get to a supermarket or a high quality grocery store was over 40 minutes and upwards of $45, which is crazy. But that's not talked about, that's not reported on, because that's not something that is in mainstream news, because people from Bed-Stuy aren't on the mainstream news. And so I spent an immense amount of time in Good Times, more than I did already. And I met these amazing people who I already knew, but really got to know even more. And I just wanted to highlight these amazing people. Edward is my favorite person in the entire world. Sorry to my girlfriend. But I got to use visual aids like maps, animations, price comparisons, and I collaborated with these students who would do a lot of things like pre-interviews for me. So they would reach out to my sources, say, hi, we have a fellow at CBS New York, and they would like to interview you, but here's some of the things that they're going to talk to you about. So that by the time I got on the phone with them or spoke to them in person, they were primed, prepped, and ready to go, and it made my life significantly easier. So shout out to my Northeastern students. Yeah, we can go to the next one, Leanna. So the product, it was incredibly less formal. It was a deep dive into the cultural significance. And like I said, we used data visualization, and video and graphics were optimized for social. So we had a regular 1820 by 1960 broadcast size version of it, but we also broke it down into 3 different Instagram videos or TikTok, whichever is your favorite, and had a series that went onto the social media platforms to break it up into 3 succinct stories that could each live and breathe on their own. But it was a web series as well as a short form series, and was received extremely well. We had so many comments, so we also collaborated with Good Times, the bodega, on Instagram. And so all of the comments were just flooded with all of the Bed-Stuy residents like, that's my bodega on the news. All these people felt represented and seen in a way that they hadn't, and that is the complete point of underreported stories. So getting to see that was incredible for me. And the biggest thing also was it created potential for broader conversations around solutions for equitable food distribution. It actually started conversations. I learned so much more than I didn't. I used to refer to these areas as food deserts. I learned that it should be referred to as food apartheid. These aren't things that were chosen in a vacuum seal. They were decisions that were made consciously, which is why it's food apartheid. If you want to talk about it later, let me know. I have a lot to say about it. But anyway, I'd like to show you, this is a long video, but I would just like to show you the first minute or so of it. And if you like it, you can go watch the rest of it on YouTube.
These are some of the sounds of a Bed-Stuy bodega. You always know you're getting close to a bodega when you smell the food and hear the music.
Everybody knows me as Chivo. That's Spanish for goat, if you didn't know. We really wanted to give everybody the bodega experience we had as kids. Bodegas always try to cater to the entire neighborhood. It's pure convenience, and it's why the bodegas are very important in the neighborhood.
What's more valuable, your time or your money? That's the decision many New Yorkers must make every week living in communities without easy access to a supermarket.
There are many challenges that entail food access. One is distance. We're trying to stay away from the term food desert because it connotates that the formation or where the food stores are located, it's naturally occurring, and we know that's not true.
Angela Trude is a professor in the nutrition program at NYU. She is also a researcher studying access to affordable, nutritious food within low-income communities.
There are some terms like food apartheid that are more recently being used.
Most of the bodegas are in very densely populated areas. Most of the times located in community of color, or community that have been neglected for a long time, where the largest supermarkets or the national retailers would not have dared to come in.
Isidro Medina is the president of the Washington Heights Business Improvement District. He works to support small business owners in a variety of ways, specifically with transitioning into the digital age, helping small businesses, like bodegas, become visible to a wider audience. Supermarkets are defined as less than 40,000 square feet, with multiple services offered and thousands of products, while grocery stores have more limited products available, not considered one-stop shopping, and generally have higher prices. I calculated the average commute from my block in Bedford-Stuyvesant to a supermarket, an average of 3.9 miles away. It costs $5.80 round trip on the subway, or between $56 and $96 round trip on rideshare. The subway is an hour and 22 minutes round trip on average, while the drive is 58 minutes round trip on average. So residents are left with a choice of spending excessive time or money to get to a supermarket or shopping at their local bodega. But convenience isn't the only reason residents patronize their community bodega.
So, if you want to see the rest of it, you guys are going to have to watch it on YouTube. But this was a really great experience that I got to have. It really deepened the ties that I had with my own community, and also brought my community to the forefront of a conversation that I thought was incredibly important. So, thank you guys for watching.
I too am a stander. Oh, thank you. So hello everybody, my name's Leanna, and I was embedded at WCVB in Boston, and that's where I am now currently, and loving it in Boston very, very much. So, and shout out to my Boston team. They have been so amazing this past year, and so just really been supportive and had so many great ideas. So thank you. Some of you are in this room. So the students came to me with a pitch, and they were like, Boston is kind of like the less cool younger brother of nearby New York City in terms of its nightlife. And I had spent the last 10 years working in rural America, and I'm like, what are you talking about? It's so cool in downtown Boston. But I go to bed by like 10:30 every night, so what do I know? But the students said, no, actually there are substantial reasons in data showing why Boston's nightlife isn't like that of other cities, especially given the large student population here. It's really lacking, and we're going to tell you why. And so I said, let's hear it. Actually, go back to the first one. Sorry. So they told me things that I did not know. I learned through this pitch that Boston does not have a happy hour. It is illegal, which shocked me. I also learned, I learned and experienced myself that Boston is very expensive. It's expensive to go out here. There are limited liquor licenses. That has changed since the production of this story, but that was one of the barriers to having more nightlife opportunities. Reduced late night transportation as well, which limited people's opportunity to go out and then safely get back home. And we mentioned happy hour. So they had this question about, here are Boston's unique challenges. How do they maybe compare to some of those other big cities that do have really robust nightlife, which isn't just a question of fun, but it's a question of economics and business. So the process. So the students were so helpful. Again, I was very new to Boston, and so they were instrumental in helping me walk through this process. So they helped connect me to and lead me to talking with Boston's newly hired night czar, which was instrumental to this story. They also connected me to a bar downtown and some of the management there, and like Maggie had mentioned, did a pre-interview to make sure that they knew who I was when I would be reaching out and what I was looking for. And then they also talked to partygoers, people who were going out at night, asking them their opinions about their experiences going out in Boston. They also helped gather data on transportation, liquor licenses, and the laws around alcohol services, and the happy hour ban. And I also, examined what had CVB, what had other outlets in the area been covering on this topic as well. And it seemed like some of the more recent articles were about, oh, Boston's going to try and hire a night czar, and then there wasn't too much after that. So I turned to the students, and in my own newsroom, shout out Phil, who is here, who is our head of digital, to understand the ecosystem as I was going into this story. So with that, and I have to say, as somebody who spent most of the last decade as an MMJ, where every morning I go in and I pitch 2 stories and I have to do that research and interviews and get it all done by 6, to have the students come with like, here's who you can talk to and here are the visuals and here are the graphics you can do. I was like, oh my God, do it every day. I loved it. So with that information, I was able to conduct interviews, collaborate with Gabby, and then go out and shoot and then put together these pieces. And like Maggie said, we work to optimize and really structure our web article for this as well, craft push alerts for the story. And then also, we did a second iteration of the story when the Office of the Night Czar had announced some nightlife grants that the city would be giving out to help revitalize the nightlife. So some of the elements that you see pictured here at the bottom was me going out for research, but doing it appropriately so. But I went out at night. I went out and I talked to patrons at these places as well, and talked to people who had been working in the nightlife industry. And so what I learned too was it wasn't just a story about economics, but it was also a story about culture and lifestyle and how much nightlife had shifted since the pandemic. You weren't having so many people who were coming in downtown from other places who were then going out for drinks after work. The way people were enjoying their nightlife was different. This guy who works at the Point downtown said, they're not chugging vodka Red Bulls every night for better or worse, but the experience now that people want is a maybe like a craft cocktail experience. They want Instagrammable. They want experiences. So I also found that very interesting as part of our dive into this. So I shot on my camera, but I also shot with my phone so that I made sure that I had visuals optimized for when we got this story onto social media. And one of I think my favorite animations that Gabby did was we took the data that the students had provided about when the public transportation in each of these cities stopped for the night. So we could really show how much earlier Boston's T stopped running. And we heard from a lot of people, if I go out, I either have to make sure I can walk back, get a ride, or Uber. Ubers are expensive because my options for transportation are limited. So this was such an interesting story that I don't know that I necessarily would have come up on my own. And to have the students doing the data pulls for me, talking to people, was incredibly helpful. And if we go to the next slide, we can talk about the response. Aidam, I quoted you here because I think Aidam said better than I can what I think this story did. But he told me this was something that I talked about at nearly every party I went to, but never saw on the 6 o'clock news. So that really told me that we kind of hit the nail on the head with doing something that people in the age demographic that we were trying to target found value in. So the structure of this was different from maybe something that I had been doing for the 6 o'clock news previously. My approach, as you'll see, was a little bit less formal. The delivery was a little less formal. I included music and, when appropriate, injected some humor. We did visuals and graphics optimized for social. And so, as I mentioned, we had an initial web video story and text to go along with that, the YouTube video, and then the follow-up with the Night Czar, where we took the first version and that updated nightlife grant and put it into a vertical version. We had a lot of people who had something to say about this topic. We saw a lot of feedback on the first story on Facebook and then also on Instagram and TikTok. I actually had a friend who is a meteorologist in Orlando tell me that his friend in Raleigh saw this story on her For You page on TikTok, which I thought was very interesting. But that kind of made me realize, okay, maybe this is getting around and this might resonate with people outside of Boston as well. So it had above average performance on YouTube, and it had good traffic on our web story as well. One of the things that we look at is what is the ratio of people who are coming to that web story who are then also watching the video, and we were seeing some good returns on there as well. So that's a little bit about the process, and now we'll play the video.
Well, now Boston's nightlife has had this reputation that it's kind of uncool, especially compared with other big cities like New York or Chicago or Austin.
Yeah, I don't know. Philly's better.
2 a.m.
This is basically where everywhere closes.
A club like the one in Denver would have been really fun, but it's okay.
Even City Hall is talking about Boston's nightlife.
Boston is a fun city. I don't care what some people are saying, but we don't give that fun an outlet often.
Just last year, the city hired its first director of nightlife economy, aka the Night Czar.
There's no place like Boston.
Korean Reynolds is correct, and it's because of its uniqueness that Boston has unique barriers to growing its nightlife. Chris Sweeto, bar manager at The Point, has a few points to make.
You laughing at that?
Sweeto has been working the night shift in Boston since about 2017 and says the city has gone through some big changes in that time, not the least of which was a global pandemic.
You know, there's a lot of people who are in the office a lot less, so that definitely changes, our 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock crowd.
And Sweeto says many of those who do go out aren't throwing them back like they used to.
The younger generation, the freshly 21 up to about 30, are much more into the craft cocktail scene rather than doing the vodka Red Bulls all night.
And yeah, all right, so maybe that's not like the worst thing, but Sweeto says they are missing a tool he believes could get more people in the door. That's because Massachusetts law bans happy hour. Barriers still remain high for selling liquor any time of the day. Liquor licenses in Boston are limited, just around 1,000 total. And if you can get one, you'll be paying for it.
Prior to the pandemic, they were going for about 450,000. Since then, we're going for about 600,000.
The law requires alcohol service to end by 2 a.m., and that's the cutoff for live entertainment too. But your ride may get cut off even sooner. In Boston, most public transportation only runs until just after midnight. Austin, by comparison, will tow you around till about 3 a.m., and in Chicago and New York, there are public transportation options 24/7.
I live in Lowell, so there's no transit really.
For these reasons and more, the city established the Office of Nightlife Economy to revitalize the industry.
In year 2, it's a lot more action, I'd like to say.
In the last year, Reynolds says there's been a lot of community listening, and the city passed a home rule petition to expand the number of liquor licenses, putting their request in the hands of state legislators. That's who would also control any changes to the happy hour ban. But Reynolds' office just announced $250,000 in ARPA funding for nightlife revitalization. It'll create grants for events focused on accessibility, cultural expression, intergenerational gathering, alcohol-free socializing, weekday activities, and hangouts for the under 20 crowd.
We want to work with folks throughout the city to think through what do those spaces look like? How can we help create those spaces?
Of course, it's not all bad out there.
There's a lot of cool things in Boston.
We're literally partying in historical areas. These are where your founding fathers went.
And you're encouraged to share your input to help make Boston's nightlife diverse, robust, and cool.
So for me, a lot of the highlights in helping tell the story were the animations. So I'm going to kick it to Gabby, who will talk about what it was like to work with all three of us at the same time and taking our ideas and bringing them to life.
So animation, we covered this a little bit in our panel, but in case you weren't there, I'll kind of recap a little bit about animation, but basically it's there to tell kind of complex facts, figures, things that don't normally get covered with just video. When you're getting started in creating animation, there's not one way that everyone does it. It's not like it's a template. It's more kind of you want to make it as customized as you can to your story. And so kind of this was the process that I went through as I was working with all of the fellows. The first thing I wanted to do was to get my facts straight. I really wanted to hear about all of their stories, kind of go through their scripts, see the kind of first drafts of the stories, and collaborating with the students even as they're researching for the underreported stories when they're looking for different topics, like to understand where they're coming from and what to highlight as I'm like creating the animations. So that was kind of where I always started. So wanting to do that, and like for my graphs and things like that, I wanted to get the numbers right. I was in Google Maps, like when I was creating the maps for Maggie, like overlaying, making sure I got the right subway stations. And when I made the train graph, even though it looked stylized, I did like do my math to make sure that the proportions between each trains were accurate to what I was trying to demonstrate in the visuals. So from there, like, I try to find appealing design. You can find inspiration from anywhere, really, not just online, but like the world around you, and trying to connect it to the story, like the trains for the Boston nightlife, bodega-style graphics for the bodega story, and other stories that I've done going from there. So that was a big part of creating the animations. Okay. So like when you actually get into the weeds of animations, I would say 90%, 80-90% of the animation is just created just in the stills. So making sure that you have those key moments laid out and designed well, that will take you further than, you know, putting a bunch of keyframes and kind of going crazy in the animation and having all these distracting visuals. So making sure that the initial creation is well read and well understood by the audience, you know, at first glance, that you can understand what the visual is trying to say, is probably the most important part of animation. And you know, you can go as simple as or complex as you want, but you know, in the end, simple is best, so that it's readable, it's understandable. As it goes by, people can see your visuals and then continue with the story and understand what you're trying to say. But then from there, like once you get ready for animation, the program I use mostly is After Effects, and that's kind of my bread and butter. I'll use a bunch of other Adobe programs to support it, like creating the visuals and things like that, like Photoshop, if I'm doing like mixed media, going and finding different stock images, or Illustrator if I'm doing more vector style animation, and kind of separating all the layers so I can do like characters or other types of animation. But then I'm trying to also incorporate more 3D into my workflow, which can be done in Cinema 4D, which is the industry standard, but I use more of Blender, which is free and open source. But like if you are confused and wondering where to start, I would highly recommend, like, YouTube has thousands and thousands of hours of great video support and tutorials that can just get you started, even in the simplest things, so that you can be able to create your own customized animations that's not just a template, that's not just kind of impersonal, but can bring more character to your story.
Yeah. We're going to move on to a workshop because we want an opportunity for you guys to talk amongst each other. But I guess before we do that, does anybody have any questions or any thoughts? Yeah. You don't have to have questions, that's okay. But I just wanted to make sure before we move on. Going once, going twice. Any questions for our students in the room? Okay. So we're going to encourage you to buddy up, find one other person, maybe somebody that you don't work with or you're not in the same market. And what we're going to do is hand out that same graph that you saw that the students compiled, that was the data scrape from all three of our markets combined into one. So we'd like you to turn to a neighbor and collaborate and use the data chart to choose an underreported story topic. And our hope is that you can then take this back into your newsroom when you go back home and have a foundation from which to start building on a news story. So start by choosing your topic, and it can be market specific or generic. Determine the data that you might incorporate, and we're following the same framework that the students followed in creating their pitch that they gave to us. So we're modeling that here, but determine the data, if not specific data, the kind of data that you might be looking for and where you might be able to start searching for it. Or in Maggie's case, where there was no national data on bodegas, how you might go about trying to find that data yourself. Identify any potential voices. If not specific people or organizations, identify the types of sound you source. So in Angela's case, knowing that you'd want to talk to maybe you don't know who that person is yet, but the type of voice that you would want to have in your story. Outline what kind of visuals you may need. Consider potential graphics and animations you might use to tell that story. And then discuss the format. How would you structure versions of this story for on air versus online, on social, and then potentially an OTT application. So we just invite you to do this thought process and experiment, and we will also gladly join you to chit-chat with you about...
Walk around and answer questions, talk to you about it. This is all, doing underreported stories has been, for me personally, the highlight. And all of those stories have been my best performing stories digitally as well. So there is a complete correlation between stories that people are wanting to see and that aren't being reported on by mainstream news.
Yep.
Okay, go.
No, we're doing it.
Thanks, Maggie.
So funny.
Thanks. Thanks, Aidam.
I didn't know there's so much crumbs and popcorn surrounding me. It looks like I look so ridiculous up here.
You got to snack while you can.
Oh, I love that there's discussion going on, and I don't want to interrupt that. I do just want to give a couple more minutes to wrap up thoughts, and then maybe just go around the room and talk about some of the ideas that were formed, unless, I know some of them are just like in very infancy, brief ideas, and like maybe we have ideas about animation stronger than visuals, but I know we're wrapping up around 4:45. Does anybody at this point want to share a little bit about what they've talked about? Love.
So we're on the lesbian crew right over here, and we were just discussing about the very real issue of why don't we have more like spaces for lesbians, specifically, you know, lesbian bars are very rare. So we started talking about like the Lesbian Project that's been documenting all the lesbian bars throughout the country. And so that could be some cool like mapping, visualizations, graphics we could do as well. And then we also started talking about, you know, third spaces that are specifically for, and I'm sorry to cis men, but non-cis men specific. Yeah, we were just, I think like that's been kind of like a business opportunity. So, and an underreported, I think, as well. So I think that's what we would focus on.
Yes, it was a very great conversation. Anybody else?
We were inspired by the bodega story, I think. I'm from Vermont, so trying to find a tie from like bodegas and their kind of distance between the community that they actually serve and general stores in Vermont, which have been facing really weird tide changes over time, and people that necessarily can't, you know, just go to a Hannaford's or like a Shaw's or whatever grocery store we have up there, and kind of the history and the community that's focused around those things, and being able to draw different data from like state health departments or from like local storytellers that shop at those general stores every day, and being able to hear, you know, what it means to them and their perspective that they bring, and all sorts of stuff. So kind of just getting started on it. What's the name of your YouTube video, by the way, so I can actually get it? Because I was like getting really into it, and then
The cost of convenience, the corner stores around New York City. I appreciate your enthusiasm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I toss it to you guys to talk a little bit about what you, particularly on the animation front?
Sure. So we were talking about, I guess, like how to figure out our topic, right? And so we stumbled on, or like settled on education, and sort of the topic of like what is happening in local schools, and maybe something that is affecting local schools right now are like ICE raids and like communities who are undocumented, not being able to actually be able to tell their stories, right? So that's something that Lilia was trying to figure out how do we get these people stories heard and visualized as well, because like we don't want to keep these people on blast, right? They're like afraid for their safety, like they're not even leaving their houses. So something that I do is I'm more of a visual maker. My brain immediately just could think of like a sequence of like going doc style with like, you know, like filming hands and like maybe like very nondescript like B-roll, or what would be called B-roll. And then like, let's say we have a family who has like a child who's willing to draw. They are able to draw out whatever situation what is happening, or like how they're perceiving the situation, right? And then you could bring someone who animates it and like take the illustration of the kid and then make like, you know, like movement, like added movement, like make the different layers of like the characters or like what they have been drawing and put that, you know, on screen. There's also like, if you don't have that many drawings, like there's like the opportunity to actually, you know, like pop up text. So like you could pop up the text of like the translation, but also like maybe like in like an instance of like a community that Leanna would be like highlighting like Portuguese, because like there's like a lot of Brazilian immigrants in like a specific area. So you could like kind of have like the nuance of both like the actual language that they are speaking and the translation that hopefully they are comfortable with.
thank you everybody so much
Thank you guys
for coming, and thank you to Mike and all of you guys. It's been such a pleasure. So thank you for coming, and I hope you can walk away with some, a foundation of an idea that you can build upon.